At present, very little information is known as to what would be the post-referendum status of Southerners in the North. There is also very little information available at this stage on voter registration procedures. For example, will nationality citizenship for the purpose of voting depend solely on ethnicity, or will other factors will be taken into consideration, such as, for instance, the residence? But then comes the problem, how people are going to be able to provide evidence for the length of their residence where they are living. Failure to address these questions quickly could lead to statelessness and even to some new displacement. Thus, it is essential that the issue of citizenship be placed high on the political agenda and that respective population be made aware of their option. Negotiation on citizenship should not be treated as a last-minute bargaining chip. Rather, agreement on citizenship rights must be reached soon in order to allow individuals to make informed decisions regarding the voting and regarding their future. If agreements cannot be reached prior to the referendum, reassurances should be provided to the affected population in order to avoid a panic that could be related to deadlines and to help calm the situation in the context of rising tensions. There should be transitional agreement and, if necessary, a moratorium on the government actions relating to citizenship in order to preserve the status quo until another agreement is worked out. Let me conclude, Mr. Chairman, member of the Commission, with 5 priority recommendations for the US government and the international community that UNHCR would like to table. The first one, I think, is to emphasize in all your contact with Sudanese officials, especially members of the government of South Sudan, the continued need to delink the referendum on the return movement. Making plans about return of 500,000 people are not realistic. It's important that those movements occur in a climate of respect for the principle of choice and of movement, and that secondary displacement is avoided. Second recommendation would be to support diplomatic efforts to address quickly outstanding issues under the Comprehensive Peace Plan and ensure that the referendum is conducted freely, fairly, and on time. Any delay could be conducive to violence. Third recommendation would be to support the planning efforts by the humanitarian agencies on the ground to prepare for a possible significant return movement to Southern Sudan in the period leading to the referendum or just after the referendum. To answer the question you put, Assistant Secretary Schwartz, earlier on, Mr. Chairman, I don't think humanitarian agencies at this stage are ready. We are ready to absorb a couple of thousand returnees, but we certainly don't have the capacity to absorb and assist the government of South Sudan to receive 500,000 people in the next 3 months. Fourth recommendation would be to encourage the parties to prioritize negotiation on citizenship and facilitate an agreement on this point. There's been a lot of talking in New York, but there's not been any decision taken regarding citizenship. UNHCR participates as an institutional expert in a joint task force between the government of Sudan and the government of South Sudan on citizenship, and we need the support of the US government for the participation in that task force in order to make sure that we reach on time a realistic agreement. Then, and I don't want to talk about worst case scenario, but you mentioned that article in the New York Times this morning. We have to be prepared also for the worst. That's part of our work, and we have to learn the lessons of what did not work in other situations in the past. Should large-scale violence be directed at the Southerners in the north or at the Northerners in the south after the referendum, we would like to urge the US government as well as the international community to immediately intervene in the international area, but also to provide funding support for immediate safety measures such as airlifting or safe corridor if appropriate and if feasible. I thank you for your attention, and should you have any question, please.
Well, thank you very much, and we're going to now turn to Mr. Mr. Gobidon, and we also want to congratulate you on your new position. Welcome back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and Representative Smith, Representative Edwards. I want to really thank you for your interest in Sudan. It's a country which is at the top of the concerns of the humanitarian community here, and I think it's a very timely occasion to discuss these issues. Refugees International, as you know, is an independent, non-governmental organization which advocates for protection and life-saving assistance to victims of forced displacement. I will not cover Darfur in any length because my colleagues have been prevented from accessing Darfur since 2006, but I will just say one thing. The current plans of the government to relocate or return to areas of origin large numbers of those displaced people who are in settlement is worrisome because it doesn't seem to be following international principles on how these processes should take place, which is assessing voluntariness and preparing the areas of return. So we would certainly caution against these movements. And at the time when many agencies have been removed from Darfur, I would advocate for continued support of UNHCR, I should say, which despite the constraints under which they operate in Darfur, remain one of the few agencies who can try to deliver some protection there. I will focus my comments today on the question of Southern Sudan as the country is approaching a historical crossroad with the referendum planned for the 9th of January. And while we all hope things will go well, the signals, as have been discussed here, are rather worrisome right now. The plight of Southern Sudanese is one which is particularly close to my heart, Mr. Chairman, because when I began work with refugees well over 25 years ago, I had to deal with the lost boys who had survived massacres, survived the gruesome ordeal to try to get out of the country, and had reached pathetic camps in southern Ethiopia where they were suffering horrible nutrition deficiencies that you read about in the books of Captain Cook, but are certainly not something of the 20th century. And I'm glad that today I can sit here with some lost boys who have overcome all these terrible moments. What is the situation right now? And my comments are based on 3 field missions that my colleagues have undertaken this year in Khartoum, southern Kordofan, the Blue Nile, and Juba. And they've talked to displaced people, they have talked to officials from the government, and they've talked to the relief community, UN, and other NGOs. The first point in our assessment is that the preparation for the referendum is well behind schedule. The Referendum Commission for the South has just released its budget, is already saying that the registration will be delayed. And when we heard the president of Southern Sudan, Salva Kiir, last week, he was very worried about being able to prepare things on time. And I think we have to remind ourselves all the time that Southern Sudan is the size of Texas, and it has 50 kilometers of paved roads. So any undertaking to reach out to the population is a massive operation. In Abyei, there is no agreement on the demarcation of the border. The decision of the arbitration court has been refused by the parties. The referendum commission has not been established. So there are big worries again as whether this concomitant referendum can take place on time. And third point is that the popular consultation in Blue Nile and Southern Kordofan, which was planned for in the CPA, there is absolutely no indication whether it's going to take place, in which conditions, etc. So a lot of the provisions for getting ready early January are not in place. The big second element of the situation that we believe is serious is that instead of seeing the parties coming together to try to say how do we fix something that is in the best of case difficult to organize, tensions between the parties are rising. And I don't know if you read, but just this morning, Reuters reported that one of the leaders of one of the nomadic tribes close to Abyei, the Miseria, has made absolutely blasting statements saying that if they are not allowed to vote, they will release hell on the population in Abyei. So this is the conditions in which we are all working now. Third point, in our discussion with populations, both in Khartoum and in in southern Kordofan, we have sensed a tremendous anxiety over the lack of clarity of what might happen to them. Southern Sudanese in Khartoum, you have mixed feelings. Some say they would like to go back and they don't have the means, and they would like to go back perhaps as a means to protect themselves from untoward events. Others say we would like to stay, but we don't know if it's safe. Total lack of clarity, and I don't think we can assume all of them would want to go back, but certainly they would want to have some guarantees. And people living, of course, in the transition area, in the border areas, these borders that are poorly demarcated, are extremely worried that whatever happens early January would just give rise to additional tensions. Now, people know better than all of us, and when they tell you we're very worried about what's happening, I think it's something we should listen to very carefully. There has been discussion, there has been agreement in principle in the CPA that citizenship should be something discussed between the parties. There is very little progress in this direction. That is also one of the points that concerns us very much. We're very glad to see that PRM has just recently accepted to fund UNHCR to carry out an intention survey among Southern Sudanese in Khartoum, which would give us an indication perhaps of what is the proportion of Southern Sudanese who would like to stay and what the proportion of those who would want to go back, so we can plan accordingly. Public position by very senior government officials are extremely worrisome. We were very pleased to listen to President Salva Kiir say at UCIP last week and then at the International Peace Institute in New York that Northerners would be protected in Southern Sudan. We have not heard anything to that effect from the North. We have heard from the Minister of Communication, as was mentioned earlier, rather blunt statements which to me are equivalent to a call to violence, and this is one additional complication in our current in the current outset now. We must not forget that this whole situation takes place on a backdrop of continuing emergency in Southern Sudan. You have large numbers of people who have been returned in the past years. The appeal of the UN is barely funded above 50%, well over three-quarters in the year. The return and reintegration part of that appeal is only funded 20%. So all the agencies working in Southern Sudan are working against the clock with the problems they already have, let alone being ready for additional problems. There has been incidents, and I think it's worth mentioning, of South-South conflict. And this year the UN has reported over 150,000 people being displaced by conflict between southern groups and about 700 people killed. So this is something we have to keep in mind as also potential for trouble in Sudan. There has been progress in preparing a contingency plan for the period around the referendum, and the UN has come up with a series of proposals. This is a welcome development because earlier in the year some agencies were worried about talking contingency when they thought they should have planned for something positive. So that trend has been reversed and there is now a contingency plan. And on the current situation, the last comment on the United Nations mission in Sudan, the peacekeeping mission in Sudan, it does have authority for protecting civilians, but it is extremely poorly equipped. It has no training and really no serious concern about civilians. That goes from the Security Council to the troopers in the field. And though it has its authority, it's not really able to deliver on that authority. And the level of equipment is worrisome, particularly if we consider that now I think that 16 of the helicopters they had at their disposal are to be withdrawn just a few months before what we think may be a very difficult time. And finally, on UNMISS, we regret that despite their limitation, we thought they would have been the best instrument for monitoring of the referendum, but we were hoping a few months ago that this would be indeed the case, but the parties have refused that, and they have asked UNMISS only to provide logistical support, but not to be involved in monitoring. And among all the different groups that plan to monitor, they probably would have been those most able to deploy in large scale in southern Sudan. Now, our